The blood never washed away. That's what old Jeremiah used to say before they found him hanging from the cypress tree behind the mill, his tongue black as bayou water, his eyes rolled back white as cotton bolls. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This story begins in 1837, when Louisiana was still young and wild, when the Mississippi Delta held secrets deeper than its muddy waters. Magnolia Grove Plantation sprawled across 3,000 acres of the richest soil God ever blessed upon the earth. Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds from ancient oaks, and the air was thick enough to drink, heavy with the scent of jasmine and something else. Something that made the horses shy and the dogs whimper when the wind blew from the east, where the old sugar mill stood like a monument to suffering. Elias Thornfield had bought the plantation site unseen from a Creole family who'd fled to New Orleans without explanation, leaving behind their furniture, their slaves, and, according to local gossip, their sanity. The price had been too good to refuse. $12,000 for land worth 3 times that amount. Elias thought himself blessed by Providence. He had no way of knowing he'd purchased a piece of hell itself. The widow Beaumont came with the property. That's how the bill of sale read, though nobody could explain exactly what that meant. She lived in the overseer's house, a modest white cottage that sat apart from the main plantation like an island of quiet in an ocean of industry. Celeste Beaumont was her name, though the field hands whispered it with the same reverence they reserved for prayers and curses. She was perhaps 30 years of age, with skin pale as moonlight and hair black as a starless night. Her eyes held the color of storm clouds, gray and shifting, and when she looked at you, truly looked at you, men said they could feel their souls being weighed. The previous owner had mentioned her briefly in his letters, describing her only as essential to the plantation's operation and warning that she was not to be disturbed. Elias arrived on the October morning when the mist still clung to the bayou like spirits refusing to depart. He brought with him his new overseer, a man named Camden Hayes, who'd come highly recommended from the cotton plantations of Georgia. Hayes was a large man, broad-shouldered and thick-armed, with a voice that could be heard across 3 fields and a temper that could be felt across 4. He'd managed slaves before, he assured Elias, and he knew how to maintain discipline and maximize productivity. The current arrangement would not do, Hayes declared after his first walk around the property. The widow Beaumont had the field hands working in patterns that made no sense, rotating crops according to what she claimed were ancient Creole traditions, allowing rest periods that seemed arbitrary, and worst of all, permitting them to sing while they worked. Singing, Hayes insisted, led to thinking, and thinking led to rebellion. Elias found the widow in her garden that first evening, tending to plants he didn't recognize. Night-blooming jasmine twisted around posts driven deep into the black earth, and something that looked like morning glory, but bloomed purple-black in the darkness. She didn't look up when he approached, her pale hands moving among the strange flowers with practiced precision. "Mrs. Beaumont," Elias began, removing his hat as his mother had taught him. "I'm Elias Thornfield, the new owner. I trust the transition won't be difficult." She paused in her work then, those storm-grey eyes finding his face in the lamplight. When she spoke, her voice carried the musical cadence of old Louisiana, French syllables softening the English words like honey poured over broken glass. "Monsieur Thornfield," she said, and somehow his name sounded different in her mouth, more significant. The previous owner, he understood certain things about this land, about what grows here and what does not. "I hope you will prove equally wise." There was something in her tone that made Elias uncomfortable, a weight to her words that suggested meanings he couldn't grasp. But she was beautiful. There was no denying that, and a beautiful woman on a lonely plantation was not necessarily a burden to bear. Hayes, however, had different ideas entirely. The next morning, he stormed into Elias's temporary quarters in the main house, his face red with indignation. "That woman," he said, spitting the words like they tasted bitter, "has been filling the slaves' heads with nonsense, telling them which days they can work and which days they cannot, based on what she calls the natural order." Elias frowned. What sort of nonsense? She claims the cane won't grow properly if harvested during certain moon phases, says the grinding must only happen when the spirits are pleased. The slaves are so terrified of her they won't work unless she gives permission. It's witchcraft, plain and simple, and it's costing us money. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Witchcraft was a serious charge in Louisiana, where voodoo and hoodoo mixed with Catholicism in ways that made the church nervous and the law suspicious. But it was also 1837, and Elias considered himself a modern man, a man of science and reason. "I'll speak with her," he promised Hayes, "but tread carefully. She's been managing this plantation successfully, and the previous owner seemed to value her counsel." Hayes's jaw tightened. "The previous owner fled in the middle of the night," he reminded Elias. "His family scattered to the winds like leaves before a hurricane. Maybe we should ask ourselves why." That evening, Elias found the widow at the sugar mill, a massive stone structure that dominated the eastern edge of the plantation like a cathedral dedicated to commerce. The grinding wheel, carved from a single piece of granite, stood 10 feet high and 4 feet thick. Iron gears and wooden mechanisms surrounded it, designed to crush the cane stalks and extract every drop of sweet syrup from their fibers. The mill was ancient by Louisiana standards, built by the Spanish when they still held dominion over the territory. Local craftsmen had constructed it according to old-world methods, using techniques that modern engineers claimed were inefficient. Yet it had produced sugar for nearly a century, and under the widow's supervision, it had become one of the most productive mills in the parish. She stood beside the great wheel as if in prayer, her pale hands resting on the worn stone. In the lamplight, Elias could see dark stains that mottled the granite surface, seeping deep into the rock like wine into cloth. The previous owner had mentioned that the mill occasionally required special maintenance, though he'd never explained what sort. "Mrs. Beaumont," Elias called softly. She turned, and in the shadows cast by the grinding wheel, her face seemed different somehow, older and more knowing. "You've come about Monsieur Hayes," she said. "It wasn't a question. He's concerned about productivity, about the methods you've been using to manage the workers." A smile played at the corners of her mouth, but it held no warmth. "The methods I use have been proven over time, Monsieur Thornfield. This land, this mill, they require certain considerations that your overseer does not understand." "What sort of considerations?" She moved closer to the grinding wheel, her fingers tracing the dark stains in the stone. "The cane," she said, "must be harvested when the earth is willing to release it. The grinding must happen when the wheel thirsts for purpose. And the workers, they must understand their place in the natural order of things. Hayes says you've been telling them stories, filling their heads with superstition." The widow's grey eyes found his again, and Elias felt something cold settle in his chest. "Not stories," she said quietly. "Truth. This mill has ground more than sugar cane, Monsieur Thornfield, and it has developed an appetite for more substantial fare." Her words sent a chill down Elias's spine, though he couldn't say exactly why. There was something in her tone, something in the way she touched the stained stone, that suggested meanings he didn't want to understand. "Hayes wants changes made," he said, trying to sound authoritative. "New schedules, different methods, more efficient operations." The widow nodded slowly, as if she'd expected this. "Of course he does. Men like Monsieur Hayes, they see only what they wish to see. They believe force and fear are the only tools needed to manage human souls. But this mill," she gestured to the great wheel, "it teaches different lessons." "What lessons?" "That some hungers can never be satisfied, that some thirsts grow stronger with each feeding, and that some debts can only be paid in blood." Elias felt his mouth go dry. He was beginning to understand why the previous owner had fled, why the field hands spoke of the widow in whispers, why something felt wrong about this place, despite its prosperity. "Mrs. Beaumont," he began, but she raised a pale hand to silence him. "You will do what you think is right," she said. "Men always do. But remember this warning, Monsieur Thornfield. The mill has its own hunger, and it has been fed regularly for many years. Starve it, and it will seek nourishment elsewhere. Hayes implemented his new system the following Monday. Gone were the widow's rest periods, her careful attention to moon phases and weather patterns. The field hands would work from dawn to dusk, harvesting cane in whatever quantities Hayes deemed necessary. The grinding would happen on a fixed schedule, maximizing productivity and minimizing what he called superstitious delays. The widow said nothing, but Elias noticed she had stopped tending her garden. The strange, night-blooming flowers withered and died, and she spent her evenings inside the cottage with the shutters drawn. The field hands grew nervous, casting anxious glances toward her windows, whispering prayers in a mixture of French, Spanish, and languages that had no names. Hayes, meanwhile, was pleased with the results. Production increased by nearly 30% in the first week. The grinding wheel operated constantly, crushing cane stalks with mechanical efficiency. The mill's output reached levels that impressed even the sugar merchants in New Orleans, who began offering premium prices for Magnolia Grove's product. But Elias noticed other changes too. The horses had developed a habit of shying away from the mill, refusing to pull carts within 50 yards of the building. The plantation dogs, normally eager to explore every corner of the property, avoided the eastern section entirely. And the grinding wheel itself had begun to develop new stains, darker and more extensive than the old ones, spreading across the stone like ink spilled in water. On the 10th day of Hayes's new regime, one of the field hands disappeared. Tobias was his name, an elderly man who'd worked the plantation for 20 years. He'd been assigned to tend the grinding wheel that morning, oiling the gears and clearing debris from the mechanisms. When the lunch bell rang, he wasn't there to answer it. His tools lay scattered around the wheel's base, and his hat floated in the collection basin where the crushed cane juice gathered. Hayes organized a search, but they found no trace of Tobias beyond those abandoned tools. The man had simply vanished, as if the earth had opened and swallowed him whole. Hayes dismissed it as desertion, claiming the old man had probably run off to New Orleans to find easier work. But the other field hands knew better. They'd seen the way Tobias had looked at the grinding wheel that morning, the glazed expression in his eyes, the mechanical way he'd approached the machinery as if pulled by invisible strings. 3 days later, it happened again. This time it was Marie, a young woman who'd been feeding cane stalks into the wheel's massive maw. The lunch bell found her absent, her position empty, only a few drops of something dark staining the stone where she should have been standing. Hayes was furious, ranting about slave rebellions and the need for tighter security. But when he tried to examine the grinding wheel himself, something strange happened. Elias witnessed it from the mill's entrance. Hayes approached the great stone wheel with his usual aggressive confidence, but as he drew closer, his steps began to slow. His posture straightened, his arms fell to his sides, and his face took on that same glazed expression the field hands had described. He walked toward the wheel like a man in a trance, his thick boots echoing on the mill's stone floor. "Hayes!" Elias called, alarmed. "Camden, stop!" The overseer paused, blinking as if waking from a deep sleep. He looked around in confusion, then down at his feet, which had carried him to within arm's reach of the wheel's crushing surface. "How did I get here?" he asked, his voice unsteady. That night, Elias went to the widow's cottage. He found her sitting on the front porch, rocking in a chair that had been painted white but was now weathered to the color of old bones. She didn't seem surprised to see him, didn't acknowledge his presence until he spoke her name. "Mrs. Beaumont, what's happening at the mill?" She continued rocking, her storm-gray eyes fixed on something beyond his sight. "You were warned," she said simply. "The mill has its hunger, and it has been starved. 2 people have disappeared, vanished without a trace." "Not vanished," she corrected. "Fed. The wheel must crush, Monsieur Thornfield. It is what it was built to do. For decades, it has ground sugar cane and been satisfied. But now it has tasted something richer, something more nourishing to its ancient appetite." "You're talking about murder," Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm talking about balance," she replied, "about natural order, about the price that must be paid when that order is disrupted. The next morning brought news that chilled Elias to his bones. One of the remaining field hands had found Hayes's body, or what was left of it, scattered around the grinding wheel like broken dolls. The massive stone had somehow operated during the night, despite being shut down and secured. Hayes had been crushed, ground up, processed like so much sugarcane. His blood stained the wheel's surface in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, almost artistic. The local sheriff arrived by noon, a thin man named Boudreaux, who'd seen his share of plantation violence, but nothing quite like this. The wheel couldn't have operated on its own, he insisted. Someone had to have started the mechanisms, fed Hayes into the machinery piece by piece. But there were no footprints around the mill save Hayes's own, no signs of struggle, no evidence of human intervention. Elias found himself under suspicion, naturally. As the plantation owner, he had motive to rid himself of a problematic overseer. But he'd been in New Orleans that night, meeting with sugar merchants, his alibi confirmed by a dozen witnesses. The sheriff left with more questions than answers, warning Elias to shut down the mill until the investigation was complete. But the mill, it seemed, had other ideas. That very night, the grinding wheel began to turn on its own, its massive gears creaking and groaning in the darkness. The sound carried across the plantation like a funeral dirge, a low mechanical moaning that set every dog to howling and every horse to stamping in their stalls. Elias watched from his bedroom window as sparks flew from the mill's interior, as if the stone wheel were grinding against something harder than cane stalks. By morning, the wheel had stopped, but new stains decorated its surface. Darker stains, more extensive than before, spreading across the granite like a map of territories conquered. And in the collection basin where the cane juice normally gathered, Elias found something that made his blood run cold. Fragments, pieces of bone and cloth and metal that might once have been Hayes's pocket watch. The wheel had consumed every trace of the man, processed him as thoroughly as it had processed countless tons of sugar cane. But unlike the cane, Hayes had left something behind, a residue, an essence that had soaked into the stone and awakened something that had been sleeping in its depths. The remaining field hands refused to work. They gathered in the quarters, whispering prayers and making signs to ward off evil. Some spoke of leaving, of running to New Orleans or north to free territory. But when they tried to pack their meager belongings, something strange happened. Their hands would slow, their eyes would glaze, and they would find themselves walking toward the mill instead of away from it. Elias knew he should have fled then, should have loaded his belongings into a cart and followed the example of the previous owner. But the plantation represented his life's savings, his future, his dreams of prosperity in the new world. He couldn't simply abandon everything based on what might have been coincidence and superstition. So he went to the widow one final time, desperate for answers, for some way to restore order to his investment. He found her in the mill itself, standing beside the great wheel as if it were an old friend. The grinding stone towered above her pale figure, its dark stains seeming to pulse in the lamplight like a slow, mechanical heartbeat. "You know what this is," he said. "You know what's happening here." The widow nodded, her fingers tracing patterns in the blood-stained granite. "I know what it has always been," she said. "What it was built to be. Built to be what? Not a mill, Monsieur Thornfield. A prison. A cage designed to hold something that should never have been awakened." Her words hit him like cold water. A prison for what? Something old, something hungry, something that feeds on human suffering and grows stronger with each life it consumes. You let Hayes die. You could have warned him, stopped him somehow. The widow's storm-grey eyes met his, and in them he saw depths of knowledge that no human should possess. "I tried to warn you all, but men like Hayes, they do not listen to warnings from women like me. They see only what they choose to see, understand only what serves their purposes. How long have you known? How long have you been feeding this thing? Since I was a child, since my husband died in this very mill, crushed by this very wheel when I was barely 18 years old. The previous owner, he understood the arrangement. One life each year, carefully chosen, willingly given. It kept the thing satisfied, kept it contained. But now, she gestured to the spreading stains, it has tasted violence. It has learned that taking is more satisfying than receiving. One life each year. The full horror of it struck Elias like a physical blow. You've been murdering people for years. Not murder, the widow said quietly. Sacrifice. A small price to prevent a much larger tragedy. What tragedy? If the thing in the mill is not fed regularly, if it grows too hungry, it will not be satisfied with 1 or 2 lives. It will take everything. Every slave, every worker, every soul on this plantation, and then it will spread, seeking more nourishment, more suffering to feed its ancient appetite. As she spoke, the grinding wheel began to move, slowly at first, just a tremor in the massive stone, but then with increasing speed. The gears shrieked in protest, the wooden supports groaned under impossible strain, and from somewhere deep in the mechanism came a sound that was almost like breathing. It's waking up, the widow whispered, growing stronger. Soon it will not need the wheel at all. Soon it will walk the earth in forms of its own choosing. How do we stop it? You cannot stop it, she said, but you might appease it. One final offering, one last sacrifice to satisfy its hunger and restore the balance. She was looking at him now with those storm-grey eyes, and Elias understood. He was the offering, the final sacrifice needed to contain the horror he had unwittingly unleashed. His modern sensibilities, his dismissal of her warnings, his allowing Hayes to disrupt the careful balance that had kept the thing contained, all of it had led to this moment. The grinding wheel turned faster now, its stone surface heating up from the friction, the dark stains beginning to glow like coals in a forge. The breathing sound grew louder, more rhythmic, and Elias could swear he saw shapes moving in the shadows cast by the spinning wheel, shapes that might once have been human, but were now something else entirely. I won't do it, he said, backing toward the mill's entrance. I won't sacrifice myself to feed some ancient evil. The widow nodded, unsurprised. Few would choose such a path willingly, but the choice may not be yours to make. Even as she spoke, Elias felt something changing in his body. His steps slowed, his thoughts grew foggy, and his hands began to move without his conscious direction. The same glazed expression he'd seen on Hayes, on Tobias, on Marie, was settling over his own features like a burial shroud. Fight it! Some part of his mind screamed. Run! Escape while you still can. But his legs were already carrying him toward the wheel, toward the spinning stone that had consumed so many lives, and now thirsted for one more. The widow watched from the shadows, her pale face expressionless, her storm-grey eyes reflecting the glow from the heated granite. In his final moments of clarity, Elias understood the truth about Magnolia Grove. It had never been a plantation at all, not really. It had been a feeding ground, a carefully maintained ecosystem designed to nourish something that should have died centuries ago. The previous owner hadn't fled in terror. He'd been consumed, processed, fed to the hungry thing in the mill, and now Elias would join him, becoming part of the wheel's dark history. The last thing he saw before the stone claimed him was the widow's face. And in her eyes he glimpsed something that might have been sorrow, or perhaps it was relief. Sheriff Boudreaux found the plantation empty 3 days later. No field hands in the quarters, no overseer in his house, no owner in the main mansion. Only the widow remained, tending her strange garden as if nothing had changed. When he asked about the missing people, she told him they had all gone to New Orleans, seeking better opportunities in the city. The grinding wheel stood silent and still, its surface clean of blood, but somehow darker than before, as if the stone itself had absorbed something essential from its recent feeding. The mill's machinery showed no signs of recent operation, yet the collection basins were filled with the finest sugar anyone had ever seen. Crystals so pure they seemed to glow with their own inner light. The plantation was sold again within the month, purchased by a merchant from Mobile who'd heard about the exceptional quality of Magnolia Grove's sugar. The widow came with the property, as always, essential to its operation and not to be disturbed. The new owner was a practical man, he assured the sheriff, not given to superstition or old wives' tales. But practical men, as history has shown, are often the least practical of all. They see only what they wish to see, understand only what serves their purposes, and dismiss warnings that might save their lives as mere folklore and nonsense. The mill still stands today, though the plantation has changed hands 17 times in the past century and a half. The grinding wheel continues to turn when the season demands it, producing sugar of incomparable quality that commands premium prices in markets around the world. And the widow's cottage remains occupied, though no one can say exactly by whom, as the current resident tends to avoid visitors and prefers to conduct business through intermediaries. Local historians claim that Celeste Beaumont died in 1847, buried in the small cemetery behind the main house beneath a headstone carved with symbols that no one can quite decipher. But the field workers tell different stories, whisper about a pale woman in white who walks among the cane stalks on moonless nights, tending to business that outsiders wouldn't understand. They say the mill still hungers, still thirsts for more than sugar cane when the moon is dark and the air is thick with anticipation. They say the grinding wheel turns on its own sometimes, processing offerings that no one acknowledges delivering. And they say that ambitious men still come to Magnolia Grove, drawn by promises of profit and prosperity, only to discover that some bargains require payment in currencies they never expected to spend. The blood never washed away, you see. It soaked too deep into the stone, became part of the wheel's very essence, and every drop that was spilled there created a hunger for more, a thirst that grows stronger rather than weaker with each feeding. Some prisons, once opened, can never be closed again. Some appetites, once awakened, can never be satisfied, and some widows never truly die, but simply find new ways to tend their gardens and feed their ancient, terrible responsibilities.